Many talented people of colour were snubbed in major categories. Unfortunately, there's nothing we can do about that. The Hollywood foreign press are all very, very...
Three names. Three completely different chapters of the entertainment industry over the last 6 years. One comedian who built a career on saying the unsayable and walked away mostly unscathed. One daytime icon whose brand collapsed the moment the cameras stopped rolling and the staff started talking. One woman who spent 30 years being the loudest voice in the room and then lost her own voice in a courtroom most people never think about until it happens to someone they love. These are not secretly connected stories. They don't need to be. Each one, told straight, says something real about fame, power, and what happens when the public image and the private reality stop matching up. By January 2020, Ricky Gervais had already hosted the Golden Globes 4 times. He knew the room. He knew what Hollywood would tolerate from a British comedian who didn't need its approval to keep working. Gervais has never depended on studio relationships or award season goodwill for his income. He writes and produces his own material, tours internationally, and answers to streaming deals he negotiates on his own terms. That independence is the reason his fifth and, as it turned out, final turn hosting the Globes played out the way it did. He opened the show holding a bottle of beer and told the audience flatly that he didn't care anymore, that this would be his last time hosting, and he had nothing to lose by saying what he actually thought. What followed was a monologue that moved from actor Felicity Huffman's role in the college admissions scandal to a broader critique of the entertainment companies in the room, accusing them of chasing profit regardless of who they had to partner with to get it. He told the assembled stars bluntly that if a Chinese factory made their next phone using labor most people would find unacceptable, none of them would stop using their phones, because they were all, in his words, part of the same system. The line that got the most attention afterward was his reference to Jeffrey Epstein. Gervais told the room that a number of people in it had flown on Epstein's private jet, and that they knew who else had been on those flights. It was a joke built on an accusation, delivered to a room full of people who had every reason not to laugh, and largely they didn't. Cameras caught Tom Hanks's expression shift from amused to visibly uncomfortable. Clips of that specific moment recirculated for years afterward, usually captioned with some version of "Watch the room go silent." It's worth being precise about the context. Epstein had died in his Manhattan jail cell in August 2019, 5 months before that broadcast, in a death that was officially ruled a suicide, a finding independent pathologists hired by his family publicly disputed. At the time Gervais spoke, Epstein's connections to a number of prominent figures across entertainment, finance, and politics were already a matter of public reporting. Flight logs and various court documents connected to Ghislaine Maxwell's criminal case had already surfaced pieces of that network in the years before 2020. Gervais wasn't working from secret information. He was doing what topical comedians do, taking material that was already circulating in gossip, tabloids, and partial court filings, and saying it out loud in a room that preferred to pretend it hadn't heard any of it. Gervais was not invited back to host the Golden Globes after that broadcast, a fact he has confirmed himself, without much apparent regret, in multiple interviews since. He has described his approach using the court jester framework, the idea, rooted in British comedic tradition, that a jester's function is to say aloud what everyone already privately knows, precisely because the jester has nothing that those in power can take from him. Gervais has repeated some version of that explanation for years. He wasn't performing for the 200 wealthy, famous people sitting in the room, he has said, but for the far larger television audience watching from home, people who don't have a private plane or an invitation to the party in the first place. When the U.S. Department of Justice released a large tranche of documents connected to the Epstein investigation in 2025, flight logs, financial records, and communications tying his network to figures across entertainment, finance, and politics, commentators and viewers online resurfaced the 2020 monologue almost immediately, pointing out how closely some of Gervais's lines tracked with what the documents eventually confirmed. That reaction is understandable, but it's also worth keeping in proportion. Gervais was reacting to information that was already partially public in gossip and reporting circles, not predicting the future from inside knowledge. What the documents did was convert years of rumor, tabloid reporting, and a stand-up comedian's pointed jokes into something closer to a documented record. And that shift, from rumor to record, is the real story, not any suggestion that Gervais somehow knew more than he was letting on. For 19 years, the Ellen DeGeneres show closed every episode with the same 4 words: be kind to one another. That phrase became the entire foundation of DeGeneres' brand, reprinted on merchandise, repeated in interviews, built into the show's identity so thoroughly that for most of its run, almost nobody questioned whether the environment behind the cameras matched the message in front of them. That changed in July 2020, when BuzzFeed News published an investigation built on accounts from numerous current and former staff members across different departments and years of the show's production. The picture those employees described bore little resemblance to the show's public image. Staff described a workplace culture shaped by fear rather than warmth, complaints of racist remarks and comments, employees told not to make eye contact with DeGeneres, and reports of retaliation against staff who raised concerns, including one account of an employee being effectively pushed out after taking medical leave for a family funeral. The report didn't accuse DeGeneres personally of every specific incident, but it painted a picture of a toxic environment that had been allowed to persist for years under her name and her show. Warner Media, which produced the show, opened a formal investigation. 3 of the show's top producers were removed from their positions in the aftermath. DeGeneres addressed the controversy directly when the show returned for its next season, telling her audience that things had happened on the show that shouldn't have, and taking a degree of responsibility for a culture she said she wasn't fully aware had developed under her name. The show never fully recovered its former standing. DeGeneres announced in 2021 that the 18th season would be the show's last, and the final episode aired in May 2022, closing out 19 seasons. She has since said in interviews, including in a 2024 stand-up special that addressed the scandal directly for the first time, that she felt the criticism she received afterward was disproportionate to what had actually happened, and that being labeled the meanest person in America in some tabloid coverage was painful and, in her view, unfair. Former employees who spoke to BuzzFeed and other outlets have generally stood by their accounts. In late 2024, DeGeneres and her wife, actress Portia de Rossi, sold their Montecito, California estate and moved to a farm in the Cotswolds, in the English countryside. DeGeneres has said publicly that the move, originally planned as more of a part-time arrangement, became permanent after Donald Trump won the 2024 U.S. presidential election. She's described waking up to the news the day after arriving in England and deciding on the spot to stay. Since relocating, she has kept a comparatively low public profile, occasionally sharing glimpses of rural life on social media. Her wife riding horses through the local village, a pub visit to a spot owned by broadcaster Jeremy Clarkson. Reporting from early and mid-2026 indicates the couple has since split time between the UK and the US, having also purchased a property back in Montecito, and that DeGeneres has begun taking on select new projects, including voice work. She has not returned to daily television. Wendy Williams spent close to 30 years building a media career on saying things other people in entertainment media wouldn't. She started in New York radio in the 1990s, developing a reputation for naming names and discussing industry relationships that other hosts treated as off-limits, a habit that, by her own account in a 2006 conversation with Howard Stern, contributed to her being let go from at least one radio station earlier in her career. She kept working, kept naming names, and eventually built The Wendy Williams Show, which ran for 14 seasons starting in 2008 and became one of daytime television's most recognizable talk formats before ending in 2022. Williams's health struggles became public well before the guardianship did. She had spoken openly for years about a Graves' disease diagnosis and other health issues, and the final seasons of her show were affected by extended absences tied to those conditions. In May 2022, Wells Fargo, the bank managing her finances, raised concerns with a New York court about her ability to manage her own financial affairs, and a court-appointed guardian, attorney Sabrina Morrissey, was granted authority over both her finances and significant aspects of her daily life under a New York State Article 81 guardianship. a legal mechanism used when a court determines an adult can't safely manage their own affairs. Williams's ex-husband, Kevin Hunter, later filed legal papers alleging the guardianship had been established through a process that didn't give her an adequate opportunity to secure her own legal representation. In 2023, Williams was reportedly diagnosed with frontotemporal dementia and aphasia, a diagnosis her guardian's legal team cited repeatedly in court filings to justify continuing and, in late 2024, extending the guardianship on the basis that she was permanently incapacitated. Williams pushed back publicly and repeatedly. In a January 2025 phone interview with The Breakfast Club, she said she was not cognitively impaired, describing her living situation as isolating and prison-like. She told Good Day New York she'd passed an independent competency test without difficulty. In March 2025, police came to her assisted living facility and took her to a hospital, an episode she said happened without any advance warning to her. The most significant development came later in 2025. According to reporting from TMZ and other outlets, Williams underwent a new round of neurological testing in New York, and the specialist who conducted it found no signs of frontotemporal dementia, directly contradicting the diagnosis her guardian's team had relied on. Multiple medical experts noted that frontotemporal dementia is typically progressive and doesn't reverse, which made the conflicting result especially significant for her legal team's case. Her attorneys used the finding to move toward terminating the guardianship, with her lawyer Joe Tacopina telling press outlets in December 2025 that he expected her to be free of the guardianship by year's end, framing the new medical result as effectively decisive. As of mid-2026, court filings and legal tracking coverage indicate the guardianship remains formally active while the case continues to move through the New York court system, with multiple parties, including members of her family and her ex-husband, seeking to challenge both the guardianship itself and Morrissey's continued role as guardian. A Lifetime documentary about her situation, released during this period, drew enough attention that her guardian's legal team was compelled to respond to it directly in court filings, while Williams's family has described the film as one of the more accurate public accounts of her circumstances. Williams was noticeably absent from the wave of tributes other celebrities offered when DeGeneres' show ended its run in 2022. She had been one of few daytime hosts willing to publicly discuss DeGeneres' reputation for being difficult behind the scenes, well before the BuzzFeed report broke the story wide open. That's a real, documented overlap between two of these three stories. Two women in daytime and radio media, one of whom said uncomfortable things about the other years before the wider industry was willing to say them publicly. It's tempting, especially in hindsight, to draw a single dramatic line connecting a comedian's monologue, a daytime host's workplace scandal, and a legal guardianship case. Three storylines that happen to unfold across the same general years in the same general industry. But that's mostly a trick of narrative convenience, not evidence of anything coordinated. What actually connects them is something less cinematic and more structural. Each one is a story about the gap between a public image and a private reality, and about what it costs different people, depending on how much power and independence they actually have, to close that gap. Gervais said the uncomfortable thing from a position of financial and professional independence, and the cost to him was a hosting gig he didn't especially want back anyway. DeGeneres' carefully built brand collapsed once the people who worked inside it were willing to describe what it was actually like, and the cost to her was the end of a 19-year show and a public reputation she is still, by her own account, trying to repair from another country. Williams spent her career being the one willing to say the uncomfortable thing about other people, and when her own life became the story, she found herself in a legal system that, for 3 years, controlled how much of her own voice she was allowed to use. None of that requires a conspiracy. It just requires paying attention to how differently the entertainment industry and the legal and financial systems around it treats people depending on whether they need that industry's approval to keep working or whether they're the ones the industry decided needed managing.